Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero. And on this week's episode, we are talking about the relationship between beauty and spirituality. And joining me in our virtual studio today is Rhett Diessner. Rhett is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Lewis Clark State College and Adjunct faculty member at the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education. His doctorate in human development is from Harvard University. His research interests are appreciation of natural beauty, artistic beauty, moral beauty, and beautiful ideas. He is the author of the books Understanding the Beauty Appreciation Trait, Palgrave Macmillan, 2019, and Psyche and Eros, Baha'i Studies in a Spiritual Psychology, George Ronald, Oxford, 2007, and has published in such peer-reviewed journals as Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity and the Arts, Journal of Aesthetic Education, Eco-Psychology, Journal of Moral Education, Review of General Psychology, Plus One, and Japanese Psychological Research. Thanks so much for joining us today, Rhett.
I'm so happy to be here, Lou.
Well, I really appreciate you making the time, not just because, we're from different parts of the world, but also I know that, in the beginning of the conversation, you did say, when we were setting things up, you were like, oh, I have a certain lifestyle and, the recording needs to be at a certain time. I really love that, it's just nice to kind of know that you have these ground rules about your work. And part of your work as well is, I think it's quite niche. I don't think I've got such an opportunity to talk to a professor that studied human development, first of all, and, has books like the ones that you wrote. So I'm really curious to know a bit more about your professional journey and how you got here and why you decided to study these areas and write these books.
Well, I started out with a big interest in psychology when I was a teenager. My older brother was 10 years older, and he would bring his psychology textbooks home from college. And I was like, this is so fascinating. And so, but I'm a bit of a scientific kind of guy. So my bachelor's degree was in biological psychology. So I wanted to study the brain and behavior. But it's hard to make a living in that field, and I already had a wife and children, so I went into school psychology and got a master's degree in that, and I worked in the Yakima tribal schools. So that's indigenous people that live in the middle of Washington State in the USA. And then I got asked to adjunct a developmental psychology class at the local university, and I thought, oh, I love teaching. And so I looked around to get a PhD, and so that I could be hired by college or university, and completed that, and taught at Lewis Clark State for 33 years. I love that. Teaching is fantastic. And but about the year 2000, I was also doing some adjunct teaching in Switzerland. And, so much natural beauty there. And then on my hikes, I would see these castles, and then I would go to some churches, and they were also beautiful. So I was kind of meditating on beauty and its importance in the spiritual life of humans. And I thought I should study beauty, academically, research-wise.
Yeah. That's amazing. I love that. So it sounds like, you've gone through quite a bit in your professional journey to kind of find what you really wanted to study. And today's topic is kind of in alignment with that last bit of that discovery. So, we're excited to find out more about that, especially because, I think everyone thinks about beauty and everyone appreciates beauty in different ways. But today we are combining that with the aspect of spirituality, which is probably new to some of our audience member, or actually to most people in the general public. So I'm curious to find out more about that from your perspective with your research and your work. Before we get there, we have a section called Have You Met Rhett? And this is where we get to know you better through some of your favorite things. So my first thing to ask you, especially because you're a book author, so I'm very curious, which book do you actually love?
Well, the most recent nonfiction book I fell in love with is called Soul Boom. And it kind of fits today's topic because its subtitle is We Need a Spiritual Revolution. This was written by Rainn Wilson and published last year and was on the New York Times bestseller list for a couple of weeks, and is a really beautiful book. And he's a comedian, so it's both very serious and very humorous, a great combination.
Oh, I love that. I didn't know Rainn Wilson released a book.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, amazing. I love Rainn Wilson, so definitely have to check out the book. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So next question is about a movie. Which movie have you enjoyed recently?
Well, this is also tied into books. I really liked Bonnie Garmuse's Lessons in Science. It was a tremendous page turner. And then it's not exactly a movie. It was made into a serial, but I'm going to count that as a movie. I thought they did that very well. Didn't exactly follow the book, but as a standalone video experience, it was very enjoyable. And even though I don't think people think of it as a spiritual book or spiritual movie, there were a lot of spiritually beautiful elements to it, especially along the lines of justice and social justice.
That's interesting. I have not heard of that yet, so thank you for sharing. So you are our podcast guest today, and fun fact is most of our podcast guests are actually not podcast listeners. So I wonder what the case is with yourself.
Well, I'm laughing because I do not listen to a lot of podcasts. It's true. However, the current one that I'm listening to regularly is also by Rainn Wilson, and it's sort of based on his book. So it's on YouTube and called Soul Boom, and he interviews people, and I think the byline is something like spirituality, psychology, and idiocy. So again, a nice combination of being very serious, but also maintaining some humor.
Yeah, okay. That's great. I also did not know he had a podcast. So again, something to put on my list as well. Thank you for sharing. And what about your role model in life? I wonder if you have a role model, maybe multiple role models, or some of our guests actually don't have role models.
Well, there's a lot of people that I admire, but I do have a particular role model who is a very, very spiritual person. And his name is Abdul Baha, and he lived from 1844 to 1921. And during that time, he was the head of the Baha'i faith. And he was a very selfless person. A lot of times, religions bring in a lot of money, and he always was very simple, never spent any money on himself. He was known as the father of the poor. Anyway, and so loving and forgiving. Anyway, he's a great role model for spiritual beauty.
Okay, thank you for sharing. Very in alignment with your background, actually, because I think at the beginning I was asking you quite a bit about the word Baha'i. I was like, "What is that, Rhett? That's a new word for me." So, sounds like you clearly, not only studied this area quite a bit, you've got a role model in that space as well. So, thank you for sharing. And finally, in this part, we would love to know if there is a course you've taken in your life that has really inspired you to this day.
A course I've taken in my life that inspired me to this day. Yes. Yes, at Harvard, I took a course from Chris Argyris, who was the very first professor with a university-wide appointment, and he was called a professor of communication, but I again saw, even though he never used the word spiritual, I saw him as a very spiritual person because he taught you how to never dominate in a conversation, never try to win an argument. Is more like he could actualize what Socrates said, which is always seek the truth. Don't try to push your truth on somebody, just seek the truth in conversation. And he had practical ways of doing that. It was just amazing. I'd never had a professor that could practice what they preach in the classroom. That as well as he.
That. Yeah, I love that. That sounds amazing. Actually, I kind of need that right now. So that sounds like an interesting course if he's still teaching. Thank you for sharing. That sounds really great. And I think now we've got to know you a lot better. And let's talk about today's topic, the relationship between beauty and spirituality. And since this podcast is about happiness, we always start by going through definition. We've got a lot of definitions on this show already, but I'm sure your perspective is also going to be unique because it's a very unique thing to each person. So, Rhett, what does happiness mean to you?
Well, I see happiness in three forms, from the superficial to the deep. Superficial happiness, people call pleasure, right? I enjoy good food. I like my ears stimulated with sweet music. I love beautiful paintings and architecture. So all these physical stimuli, they lead to a little drop of happiness. It's not lasting. It's very short. It's fleeting. It's dangerous to build a life on it because you end up empty. But it's a very nice part of going through life. And then a second level I think of as social. Most of our everyday happiness comes from interacting with other human beings and perhaps with other creatures. People love their dogs and cats. And that level is longer lasting, right? The relationships, the friendships, when family's going well, these things lead to a much longer happiness and a bit deeper than just pleasure. And then there's a kind of happiness I like to call joy. And this is a deep connection. And you could imagine, for instance, going to a funeral is generally a very sad thing, right? Someone has died you care about, you're crying, but you can still feel this deep connection. I mean, people that believe in God feel like I have this joyful connection with God, even when things are going bad all around me. Or there's a lot of people that don't believe in God, but they still feel this deep connection to the universe, to maybe what Thich Nhat Hanh calls interbeing, have this deep connection in there. And that can be a source of joy, even when all around you is misery.
I really like that sort of layered approach, because I think we're kind of going from the basics of, what we all experience to what would probably require a bit more in-depth thinking and introspection. Not a lot of us sort of go through life with all those layers in thinking about happiness, which is a kind of something that I've learned through the definitions that our guests have shared, including yourself. And one thing I do notice is, with age, you just kind of add on to the layers, like what the definition that you were talking about. So it's kind of like most of us start by focusing on number one, that aspects of the physical things that we notice and admire. And then beyond that, which is actually the beauty of life. And today we're talking about beauty appreciation and things like that. So I'm sure we'll touch on that a bit more. But I also wonder from your work and from your life. I'm sure it's been a very rich life so far. You've met with a lot of people, talked to a lot of different students, or even other professors. What do you think people tend to get wrong when they think about happiness?
Well, I've just been reading the work by Arthur Brooks, a professor at Harvard who's an expert on the science of happiness. And he and Oprah Winfrey just recently published a bestseller called Build the Life You Want. And he points out something I think is really worth reflecting on, which he says, happiness is not an emotion. I mean, most of us think happy, I want to feel good. I want to feel happy, right? I want to be cheerful. And he says that's just a sign of happiness. That emotion is not happiness. What is happiness, he says, is three things. It's enjoyment, which is a lot like my social level of happiness. Enjoyment comes from interacting with humans. And satisfaction with life, which means setting a goal for yourself and accomplishing it. This brings us satisfaction. And then the deeper one, which is like meaning and purpose, right? Searching for purpose, fulfilling the purpose, finding it meaningful. And I think that's very, very much worth reflecting on, that happiness isn't really to be defined as a feeling or an emotion, because typically that's how psychologists think of it.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for sharing about that book as well. Again, a new one. It's sort of an extra recommendation. So if we think about it in that sense, when you kind of mentioned that concept of build the life you want, I think of the today's topic as well, actually, because in the life that we want, obviously we would want to surround ourselves with the kind of beauty that we want in our life, and that kind of leads me to today's topic, because that's how I like to do this. I like to relate to the topic. So before we get there, the topic today, as I mentioned at the beginning, is quite niche because we're relating beauty to spirituality. So all of us know about beauty, probably, but spirituality is a space where a lot of people like myself, we younger generation, we're kind of learning more and more about as we grow older. And for our audience, if they're tuning into the podcast, they might be wondering, okay, Rhett, so what exactly is spirituality?
Yeah, well, you think beauty's hard to define. Yeah, try to define spirituality. It really takes it up a level. So I'll give you kind of a personal answer, starting with the negative. For me, spirituality is not woo-woo. It's not the paranormal. It's not superstitious stuff. For me, the spiritual is very real, and it's demonstrated in what people call the human virtues. So spirituality is about developing and expressing courage, justice, love, compassion, forgiveness. So when we see any of those in action, we're seeing spirituality in action. And so I think a way to grasp spirituality that's very real, it's observable, but at the same time, by definition, spiritual means not physical. So, like right now, there's some pretty hip researchers looking at brain studies to identify spirituality. This amuses me a little bit because from my perspective, right, spirituality transcends the physical. It's not illogical. It's not irrational. It just goes beyond those.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess that's why it's so hard to understand, because there's that, the sweet spot of where does it lie in our lives? Because, if we just talk about virtues, I guess, we can just think about it as the way that we approach everything. Whereas spirituality is kind of, what I'm hearing is kind of take it up a notch, and you have your own set of virtues or beliefs that you kind of stick to.
Well, like, I know you're going to ask me about spiritual practices later, but one thing about spirituality is it's not a moment, right? It's a way of being, and it's a way of being that we can develop.
Yeah.
It seems very likely the most important aspect of human development and encompasses all other aspects.
I think for me, it's kind of close to what you're saying. And that reminds me of this conversation I had with someone probably a year ago. I don't remember how this came about, but I remember there was a discussion. It was like a group chat. We were in the same group, we were sort of having a casual chat about spirituality, trying to understand it. I think it was a friends group. And I remember being asked, so Lu, are you spiritual? And I said, I would say so.
And so we had that kind of, discussion. And then, I explained what it meant to me, kind of similar to what you were defining as well. And we also touched on a little bit of religion. And I said to that person, I'm an atheist. Like, I understand different aspects of religions. I know a little bit about Buddhism because that's practiced a lot in my home country, in Vietnam. But I'm not a Buddhist myself. So, I understand it, but I don't practice it. And I feel like myself, I'm more of a spiritual person. And then I remember being asked, but don't you think the way you describe spirituality is kind of similar to religion? So do you think spirituality is a kind of religion? And I just did not know what to say because, it's like such a new thing that I got asked. But since you've sort of studied this area, I would love to know your take on it.
Well, it's interesting when you do religion surveys in Australia or America, the most rapidly rising category is called the nuns. And by nuns, I mean nun, not like Catholic nuns. But people are saying they don't belong to religion. But then when they, on the same survey, is spirituality important to you? This is steadily on the rise. So in looking at least the Westerners that I've studied, like I said, Australia, UK, Europeans, this category of finding spirituality very important, but wanting to distance themselves from organized religion is like the fastest growing group of people in terms of survey change, which may not actually have answered your question.
Yeah, sort of. That is interesting because, I think this is a new thing for me. And, perhaps our audience are kind of listening to this and kind of thinking, okay, now this is interesting because we're talking about beauty and spirituality. But, some of our audience members might be religious too, and others might not be. And they're kind of wondering where they stand in this area. And so, I think it's just good to understand the differences and also know a little bit more about where people are standing nowadays, especially because, like you were saying, that survey speaks volumes, right? And I think it's just something to ponder. It doesn't necessarily have to change how we see, our approach to spirituality and religion, but it's good to have that understanding because what I find is that sometimes we're just so sort of focused on a certain point of view that we forget to consider other perspective. Like myself, I didn't really think about that from the angle of, like, do you think spirituality is a kind of religion? So yeah, your answer is interesting. It's something to think about for sure, but that's not really about today's topic. So let's go back to what we're here to talk about. So now that we've understood spirituality a little bit better, I would love to know a little bit about your perspective on this. So we've got beauty, which is something that, as I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, everyone appreciates beauty and, they appreciate beauty in different ways. But obviously, our spiritual or philosophical worldview would influence the way that we appreciate beauty. And you have a book about beauty yourself. So I would love to know what your take is about this.
Okay, very good. Well, let me start back. A little earlier, I opposed the physical with spiritual, but I also want to oppose materialism with spiritual. And I think a lot of people, when they say they're spiritual, they're rejecting the materialism of so much of the world now. It doesn't even matter what economic system you're living under, is that we see so much materialism where people are putting money and things ahead of people. And we can just feel in our heart this is wrong. And we realize there's something about materialism that we need to transcend. And that's a very important aspect of spirituality. And we see this in all religions, right? We see every religion emphasizes that spirituality is important and they oppose it to materialism. Don't be grabbing all the stuff, right? Share, be nice, take care of the poor, take care of the elderly. A rich man, a rich woman who shares all of their belongings, this is a person to greatly admire. And you can see this. It doesn't matter if it's Buddhism or Islam or Baha'i or Christian or Jewish. This is in all of their teachings. And And this ties in with spiritual beauty, because when we see people that are like that, we are attracted to their spiritual beauty. They elevate us just looking at their life and what they've done. And again, all religions have people like that. Maybe they call them saints. Maybe they call them bodhisattvas. But, we see this person who is spiritually beautiful, lives in the material world, but does not get attached to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's something that is on the rise for sure. But at the same time, I think there's a struggle between, transcending that appreciation for just the materialistic beauty, as I would call them in this scenario, versus the spiritual beauty that you just mentioned. And you kind of touched on that topic of materialism, which is something that we're all dealing with nowadays in this modern world, and with the rise of social media and other things. And I think what I have noticed personally is beyond that spiritual beauty that we are trying to sort of, get more in touch with, there's also a lack of appreciation for natural beauty, for example. Because, oftentimes this is what I see, at least on my social media. People share a lot about their experiences of going out, appreciating the beauty of an exhibition, or a restaurant, or a musical, which is these are all beautiful things, right? And part of beauty is very vast, but nature gets neglected quite a bit. And then also comes that part where you talked about appreciating the spiritual beauty of different humans around us. And I think this is something that I personally struggle with. I'm sure, some people in our audience might struggle with as well, because you just kind of get caught up in the different things that people share, or, people kind of saying, oh, like you're missing out on this or that. And then you forget about simple things like appreciating natural beauty, right? And looking at people from beyond what they own or who they are, what they actually stand for. And it's not really something we plan to ask you per se, but I want to hear what you think about this, because I think appreciation of beauty, it probably has changed quite a bit, as we have grown as humans. And so, what do you think to be the trend of this, and where will we stand? Let's say in the next 5-10 years, will we have more appreciation for natural beauty, and go back to like appreciating the spiritual beauty, or will we just keep getting caught up in the materialistic type of beauty? Or is there going to be like a battle between the two? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, forecasting 5 years down the road, it actually is a great concern of mine. I've published several papers in the Journal of Eco-Psychology. So this is eco meaning, right, ecosystems, and looking at the natural world as a system of therapy. And, right now with facing climate change and pollution, and we're in really, really deep trouble. Not just our species, but all species, but humans. That the forecast is dim in the short term. And because of this concern, I've looked at the connection between beauty and love. Now, this is something that Plato emphasized. He emphasized every time you love anything, the object of your love is beauty. If it's loving another human being, if you're superficial, you're loving their physical beauty. Why not? My wife's beautiful. I fell in love with her. But really, of course, the big prize is her inner beauty. And anytime we love something, this is what we're loving, the beauty of it. So right now, it's critical. It's a critical social action that we express our love for the beauty of nature. Because whatever we love, we care for, and we take care of it. And right now, we're at a critical crossroads about that. One of my most recent publications, which was in the Journal of Eco-Psychology, was looking at the relationship between appreciating beauty and being a pro-environmental person, a person who takes pro-environmental action. And we had people take this huge test. It's called the VIA test. It profiles 24 different beautiful virtues, beautiful character strengths. And out of all 24 of those, appreciation of beauty was number one. It was the most powerful predictor of whether people will actually do pro-environmental behavior.
That's fascinating. And also, it's true. I think on the Doing Well show about well-being at LMSL, we also touched on that once, where we talked about pro-environmental behaviors. And now that you're mentioning it, it has this really strong correlation with that appreciation of beauty. And you are right. We're at a crossroad, and I think we all know about this. If we care at all about the ecosystem that we're in, we know that we're kind of struggling with this. And I think we're all taking actions, to a certain extent. When you have a certain level of awareness, it's just where we take it. And this actually, I think, goes back to your definition of spirituality, of how we connect with things beyond the physical realm, and with our virtues, for example. And you also mentioned natural beauty, which leads me to my next question about this, because I think I've read an article a while ago about the fact that when you're in nature, or this is probably part of a book that I can't remember the title now, but when you're immersed in nature and you have that sense of appreciation for natural beauty, you have a deeper sense of connection with yourself, the world around you, and, so kind of like similar to what we're talking about when it comes to spirituality. And what I'm hearing from you and connecting to that is the fact that if we appreciate natural beauty, we will have a deeper sense of spirituality. So that's just kind of my, presumptuous conclusion for now. But I would love to hear how you think the connection is made, and why that is. Why do we, when we appreciate natural beauty, we have such a deeper sense of spirituality and connections?
Well, I completely agree with what you said. Out from a theistic viewpoint, all of nature is the work of God as artist. So everything from indigenous people to people looking at major world religions, when they talk about the creation of the world, recognize that some kind of spiritual being emanated the physical world. So if we think of the deep beauty of spirituality, then nature is the prime example of that. There's even this great book written by the physicist that got the Nobel laureate for working on the forces of the atom. And his book is about, is the world created through beauty? And he never mentions the word God, but he uses the word artisan with a capital A. He thinks, based on his work in physics, and this guy's over the top brilliant at Princeton, that yes, the world is purposely designed as beautiful. So when we're out connecting with nature, and this relates to what you said just a little while ago, when we're a little bit mindful, when we slow down, when we take it all in with our eyes and our ears and our nose, and sometimes with touch, we can feel that oneness with everything. This is one of the most common things you hear people say, right? From the people in Japan doing forest bathing. Now there's a forest therapy hub all across the world that's training people to take people to the forest to, they don't explicitly say a spiritual experience, but this is what they're after. And this gives us that sense of oneness with everything. Like Thich Nhat Hanh from Vietnam, he said, right, interbeing. It's all interbeing, right? We're all completely connected with every creature. And recognizing the beauty that gives us that sense of awe when we're in nature makes it so easy to feel that oneness. And then, as you said, and research fully supports this, after people have a dose of mindful nature, they're more pro-social. they're more likely to help the people around them. So it's a win-win-win.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I can attest to this with personal experience as well. And anytime I go out on a camping or hiking trip, I come back a better person. And I feel like, I'm a better friend. I feel more connected to my people. And it's just like a nice way to disconnect from everything else and connect to nature, to connect to myself. And I think another thing is, it's not just about this sense of connections with other people, right? It's also, I think I come back, at least personally, feeling more connected to every other kinds of beauty around me. And I'll give you an example. So, for example, I sometimes just go past this park. It's nothing new. And I take it for granted. But if when I go back from a camping trip, I walk past the park and I'm like, this is beautiful. This is amazing. I take this for granted all the time. And similarly speaking for other little things, around me every day, I just don't really pay attention. But when I have that connection with nature and appreciation of beauty, for the beauty in nature, I come back and I appreciate every other kinds of beauty around me so much more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I think it kind of related to that point that you just made, not just connections with other humans, but also with everything else around us.
Yes, it's so true. We will all survive together, or we'll all go down together, all the creatures. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would wonder if, in your research, you found any other interesting correlations between this, deepened sense of, stronger sense of spirituality, when, there's a connection with, appreciation for beauty, anything else that we haven't got to cover, or maybe some fun facts from that research that you would like to share with our audience?
Well, way back in 2005, I think I did the very first study scientifically looking at the relationship between spiritual transcendence and appreciation of beauty. And that was published in 2008. And it showed significant medium-sized correlations. So they were very significant, like the p-value is 0.0001, a medium-sized correlation, which is substantial. And it showed that the more spiritually transcendent you were, the more you appreciated nature's beauty. Of course, the way correlations work, the more you appreciated nature's beauty, the more spiritually transcendent you were. And this was the same pattern for moral beauty. So looking at the inner beauty of people, the better you are at noticing their inner beauty, the more likely you're to be spiritually transcendent. And the more likely you're to be spiritually transcendent, the more you look for people's inner beauty. Now, artistic beauty also was significant, but it was a smaller correlation. But it was solid and significant. Now, fast forward to last year. Nobody's published any empirical research on beauty and spirituality till last year. And this was a team of researchers in Poland, headed up by Hyacinta Żwiatek. I can't pronounce Polish names, so I just butchered it. And her colleague, Meg Szczesniak. And they gave a couple of hundred Poles measures of what they called integrating beauty and another measure of spirituality. So integrating beauty is when you experience beauty, you bring it in so that it becomes part of your being. So they had a measure for that. And then they had a measure of spirituality. And they found very large, significant correlations. So the more you're able to bring beauty into your being, to populate your mind with it, for it to be part of who you are, the much more spiritual you became, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's interesting, especially when you mentioned that there was no research about beauty and spirituality until last year. So this conversation is quite timely.
It's new.
Yeah, it is new. But I guess, in the back of our minds, we probably always knew that it was true. And now we actually have the research to back it up.
Yes. yes, there's been a lot of people that have written about it. Philosophers and theologians have looked at this connection, but psychologists have not jumped in with empirical data till recently.
Yeah, that's great to hear, and very timely for the conversation. So I'm feeling very inspired by that. So now that we have discussed quite a bit about the research behind this and what the relationship is between beauty and spirituality, we know that this strong sense of connection between the two will only enrich our lives. That's what I'm hearing. And so I would love to talk about, a practice or a habit that you would like to share with our audience to help us to deepen this connection. So I would love to know for yourself, Rhett, if you have a personal practice or habit that you take on to help yourself deepen this connection between beauty and spirituality in your life.
Well, yes, I will talk about kind of a two-step practice that I do. And it's it's connected a lot to what the research literature calls moral beauty, but for our purposes, moral beauty is pretty much a synonym for spiritual beauty. I'm sure there's some subtle differences, and psychologists haven't worked that out yet, but there's a lot of overlap there because, like we said, justice, love, courage, hope. These things people call moral beauty, but really they're also spiritual beauty. And so as we mentioned earlier, I'm a member of the Baha'i faith, and one of our practices is a daily mantra, or at least Hindus and Buddhists will call it a mantra. Muslims would call it zikr, which means remembrance of God. And Baha'is call it recitation of the greatest name. So this, I use prayer beads, 95 prayer beads, and I get myself sitting in a nice on the floor position, on my knees, clear my mind. And on my in-breath, I feel the love of God pouring into me. And on the out-breath, I recite the mantra, which is Allahu Abha, which means God is the most glorious and beautiful. At the end of that, so I do that, it's a nice, slow in-breath, out-breath, 95 times chant. Then I pause and I think of what environments I might be in that day. So where am I going to be? Well, today I thought, I'm going to spend some time with Lu, who I haven't met. I'm going to see my wife several times. But I just picture where I'm going to be and what humans will cross my path. And then I ask myself to stay mindful of their inner beauty so that when I'm looking at them, I'm not thinking about my own agenda. I'm just appreciating the inner beauty radiating from them, and I look for it. Wish me good luck on that one.
Yeah, definitely. Good luck with that one. And it's beautiful. I think, as I mentioned to you just a little bit of about 20 minutes ago, I am not, I don't consider myself to be religious. And, I find that these different practices of different religions beautiful in their own senses. Now, some of the audience member might be like myself, where they're kind of saying, Rhett, we're actually not practicing a certain religion, but we find your practice quite interesting and, enriching. So if we're not following, let's say, the Baha'i faith or any other kinds of types of religion, what would be a similar practice that you would recommend to us?
Well, mindfulness meditation, which probably started with Buddhism, has been greatly incorporated into the West, especially among counselors, psychotherapists. And why is that? Well, because it works. And there's just tons of research now showing that it alleviates or at least helps with anxiety, helps with depression, right? The two major mental issues. And there's been a variety of approaches to mindfulness meditation with no mention of God or religion, sometimes not even mentioning spirituality. I remember meditating with a Buddhist a few years ago at my house, and he was like, what about the spiritual part? Well, these are Western psychologists. But really, it's still that being still, getting focused, being in the moment is an important skill set. And it can, like I said, that's what I do at the end of my chant, is I'm doing this mindfulness thing I'm in the moment, but I'm looking out into my day.
Yeah.
Now, to recommend a particular one, there is mindfulness strengths practice. Mindfulness, there I'm getting it. MBSP, mindfulness-based strengths practice. And this was initiated by Ryan Niemiec at the Via Institute of Character. And it's just basically taking the mindfulness skill set of mindful meditation and focusing it on the character strengths, which today we've been calling the virtues. And he's a good scientist. He shows that it actually is more effective than some of the most popular mindfulness-based therapies out there. And so this is something that anybody can do. And it reminds me of one of my heroes is Jonathan Haidt. I think he's one of the greatest living psychologists. And he just published a fantastic book that everyone should read. It's called The Anxious Generation, and it's about Gen Z and social media. It's really a critical book. But in it, well, not specifically in that book, but in his classic book, The Happiness Hypothesis, he says, what if I told you there was a pill, you could take this pill, it has absolutely no bad side effects, it is free, and it will cause you to be less anxious and less depressed. And when you take that pill, no negative side effects, cost is free, and it's going to make you a happier and less anxious and depressed person. And I'm like reading the book the first time back in 2006, and yeah, I'll take that pill. Well, the pill is meditation, right? It's mindful. So
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's great. Oh, thank you for sharing that. I was just quickly Googling the book to save it, to read it later. That sounds great. And thank you for sharing the practices. I think mindfulness meditation has been recommended on the show quite a few times. And, this in today's context of beauty and spirituality helps even more because, the more we learn about this practice, the more I just feel like it has so many benefits. It sort of applies to all of the different topics we have on the show, as far as I can see. And I think it also helps to, at least for me personally, to kind of see beauty around me a bit better, to kind of incorporate that into the mindfulness meditation. Because as I mentioned to you, a little bit before, I just sometimes miss the beauty around me. And that when I used to meditate, just on the daily, I haven't been doing that recently, but when I used to do that, I kind of do realize that there's that incorporation of the appreciation of beauty in my everyday life. And I kind of slow down and notice more, of the beauty around me. So can confirm it definitely really helps. In case our audience is wondering if it actually does help, it does. Cool. So we have approached the end of the podcast and we have a final section before we let you go, Rhett, and it's called Open Mic. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, this is your platform to share anything you would like to share with our audience that you didn't have the chance to talk about yet. So take it away.
No. Well, we've certainly touched on it, but I'm a great lover of natural beauty. And I'm very fortunate. My wife and I didn't want to live in a city. We wanted to raise our kids in a nice, quiet little community. And so I'm out here in the American Wild West with mountains and forests and rivers. And so it's very easy for me to enjoy nature's beauty. And even though, right, any green space, I think as you mentioned, even going to a park, if you're mindful there, if you're noticing the beauty, it'll just pop. But there's really something special about wild nature, and I just can't get enough of it. And it's very effective therapy. a very effective therapy. And as you mentioned earlier, like when you come back from a camping trip, you're literally a nicer person. Lots of research to show this, right? And that's what living this life is all about. That's the life of beauty, is looking to others' needs, transcending ourselves and thinking of them. It's a little bit like a Zen koan. The best thing you can do for self is to forget self. And the path of spiritual beauty is very powerful for that self-transcendence. Gets us up and out of ourselves, and lots of good research also by that same guy I mentioned, Jonathan Haidt, or inspired by his theoretical works. And we show that when we notice moral beauty, when we notice spiritual beauty, it makes us want to be a better person and sets us up to help others right then. So
thank you so much for sharing. A beautiful message to close with, for sure. And it's very in alignment with today's topic. A great reminder to anyone who is struggling to appreciate the beauty around them and, immerse in that space of spirituality, which is not that intimidating as it sounds sometimes. And thank you for your time today, being here with us. I think it's Sunday, almost evening where you are, so really appreciate it. And before we let you go, if our audience would like to find out more about your work or connect with you, where should they go?
Well, if they're a bit on the scientific side and want to read my empirical papers, if they go into a search engine and write my name and then write ResearchGate. ResearchGate is a very large database, and they can go to my pages there. If they want something written more for a general audience that explains the research, as you mentioned earlier, I have a book out on appreciating beauty, and it can be found at most booksellers. Not sure I want to mention Amazon, but it's pretty easy to find it there. And my earlier book that's on spirituality and psychology, with a nice big fat chapter on beauty, which is called Psyche and Eros, can also be found on a web engine search, for sale in multiple places. And you can get it used. Recycle, reuse.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing and for being here with us today.
It's been my pleasure, Lu. You've been an excellent interviewer. Felt very comfortable and warm around you, and I appreciate that.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.